Hello everyone, this is Dylan Harvey. I figure a lot of people probably don't know how 3D renders are actually made, so I decided to create this video showcasing the creative process that I went through in order to arrive at the finished result of my most recent 3D render that I made. It's this one here. It's called Rebel. Obviously, you can decide why on your own. It doesn't really matter. That's what I'm choosing to name it. So, the idea for this originally came while I was playing the video game Life is Strange Before the Storm. This scene in particular was the main inspiration for it. As you can see, it's a scenic overlook with viewing towers, a fence, and there's a bench that you can't actually see in this particular shot. It's kind of off to the left, but this is where the main inspiration came from. So what I'll show you now is the process that I went through in order to get from this screenshot to the final render that you see here. So after I had the idea and I kind of put the pieces together in my head, I created a sketch. I started with the sketch on the right, a top-down view of it, because I needed to know how all the pieces were going to fit together. As you can see in the sketch, it has tracks mentioned there. That's because originally I was actually going to have railroad tracks be featured in this image as well. However, I did away with that idea because I didn't think it made much sense for there to be railroad tracks that close to a scenic overlook. So I kind of decided to, and it would also take up too much it would take up too much space in the foreground, and I didn't want to pull too much attention away from what the actual scene was about. Then I made the sketch on the left, obviously, as you can see, extremely rudimentary, but it worked for what I needed it for. You can also see a lighthouse pictured there. That's actually what that is. It might not look like it, but it's supposed to be a lighthouse. I also did away with that idea because, again, I thought it would make the scene look too busy, and it might mess up the scale of the image that I had going. So I decided to stick with just the view towers, the bench, fence, rocks, and character. After I'd finished the sketches, I still didn't feel like I knew how everything was going to fit together in the final scene, so I decided to make this image here using primitives in Blender because it took a small amount of time, and everything here is to scale to the final scene, and it would help me kind of understand how and if everything would fit together in the final scene. After I decided that the scene would in fact work the way I had planned, I decided to go ahead and begin the modeling process. The image has multiple elements in it, and usually with scenes like that, you make the elements one at a time. And so I started off with the bench. I did the modeling for it and made sure it was scale and everything looked good on it. As you can see, it doesn't have any texture right now, and that's because the texturing process and the modeling process are two entirely different workflows. And so to do one and then the other, and then to go and model something else, like if I had to go and model the view towers then to, model and then texture them, and then model and then texture the fence, like people do that, and that's fine if you do it that way. But I find it's very similar to like if you were to put on your shoes like sock, shoe, on each foot instead of just sock, shoe, shoe. After I was finished with the bench, I made the viewfinders. These current viewfinders you see here were not the ones I used in the end. I ended up changing a lot about them to make them look better all around. So after the viewfinders, I added in the fence. And you can also see I jumped the camera to a different spot. That is also because I did have to rearrange the scene, everything, because the fence is what took up the most space in the scene. I decided to move the camera and everything around because I wanted to kind of see it in a better light. Because, now I have over half the elements I have about half the elements finished, so I figured it was time to see how everything was going to line up, compositionally speaking. Then I added in the boulders. As you can see, I did add texture to them, but it doesn't look anything like the texture I used in the final render. As you can see, that looks a lot better than the one you saw before. Honestly, I can't imagine a human sitting on those. That would not be comfortable. The reason I added the texture to the boulders as I was making them is because the process to deform the cubes that I used into boulders, you add the image texture to it during the process. So it all happens. So in this case, the modeling and texturing took place at the same time, and they kind of had to take place at the same time. After I was finished with the boulders, stuff kind of started to move along quite quickly. I started to add texture to everything else. I started to add texture and grass to the ground, as well as to the viewfinders, as well as to the view towers. I think I redid the texture on the bench a couple times, as well as on the fence. I made further refinements and everything. So I guess like this process, it was kind of like abandons the like one element at a time workflow in favor of simply doing what stands out the most and what you think needs done the most. But it moves pretty quickly as you go through and edit everything. So if you want a shot of what the process of that would look like, I do have one. So let's look at that. So there it is. As you can see, the ground has grass now. It doesn't look quite like the final one did. There's no path there, and obviously it looks really patchy and kind of carpety and weird. And of course, the viewfinders look a bit more finished than they did before. The fence is still had more additions undergone, and the bench also did as well. And the boulders look even worse than they did last time, and that is because the boulders had so many faces and vertices on them that they would actually slow down my computer's ability to move about the 3D scene. And so I basically turned off the the subdivision modifiers on them in order to help, I decreased the amount of RAM that they took up so my computer could actually handle modeling the rest of the scene, is basically what happened there. So you will notice in all of these images I've shown you thus far, none of them have the character in the end featured in them. The reason for this is because the character was actually done and had been done this entire time, because I didn't make her. I actually downloaded her from a website. She is actually Sintel from the Blender Open Movie Project that produced the animated film called Sintel. She's obviously the female there. Blender, because it was an open movie project, after they were done, they uploaded a lot of the assets used in it to various websites so that people could download them at their leisure and kind of do whatever they really wanted to with them, just as long as they credited the original makers of it, which this is kind of what that is. The other reason is because she really actually wasn't needed in the scene. Here's a shot of her of the scene without her in it. As you can see, it actually looks fine. Some people might say it looks even better than it did before. That's because this scene doesn't have any dust in it or camera correction, so it looks more perfect. So that obviously is not practical to real life. Probably in real life there would be some haze at this time of night, especially outside where, the scenic overlook would take place. So that's why I added in the dust. And again, character not really needed here. But so it comes down to, why did I decide to have her in the scene? That's just because I wanted her to be there. That was basically what that was. The whole scene was actually kind of centered. It started off with, in fact, the scenes popped into my head of like having a character like posed looking at the sunset, and then these other elements kind of sprouted out around her based on the Life is Strange screenshot that you saw before. And so even though the scene would have worked fine without her in it, I felt like it told a better story with her in it. And so that's why I decided to add her into the final render, which I think really completes the scene.